The chains bit into Arya's wrists like iron teeth, rubbing the skin raw until blood welled up in thin crescents around the metal. She had stopped feeling the pain hours ago, or maybe it had been days. Time had become slippery in this place, measured only by the shifting of shadows through the trees and the crude laughter of the rogues who passed by her stake in the ground like she was nothing more than a dog left out in the rain. Her belly pressed hard against her thighs as she curled in on herself, trying to protect the small life growing inside her from the cold that seeped up from the frozen earth. 5 months along now, maybe 6. She had lost count somewhere between her brother's hand on her arm and the moment he had shoved her toward the waiting wolves with their yellowed teeth and hungry eyes. He sold me, she thought, and the words still felt impossible, like a language she couldn't quite translate. Rorik sold me for gambling debts. His own sister, his own blood. But blood meant nothing to Rorik Duskwalker. It never had. Wake up, breeder. A boot connected with her hip, not hard enough to truly injure but sharp enough to send pain radiating through her bones. Arya didn't give them the satisfaction of crying out. She had learned that lesson on the first night, when her screams had only made them laugh harder. Got buyers coming tomorrow. Need you looking less like death. The rogue who spoke was called Thresh, a massive wolf with a scar that split his face from forehead to jaw and breath that smelled of rotting meat. He crouched down beside her, grabbing her chin with fingers that left bruises, forcing her to meet his gaze. Pretty thing like you, even knocked up with some dead wolf's pup, you'll fetch a good price. There's always some alpha desperate enough for a womb that works. His thumb traced her lower lip, and Arya felt her stomach lurch with revulsion. Maybe I should sample the goods first. Make sure you're worth what we're asking. Touch her, and I'll gut you myself. The new voice came from behind Thresh, low and dangerous. Arya's eyes flicked past her captor to find another rogue. Crow, she thought his name was, standing with his arms crossed and his expression twisted with something that almost looked like possessiveness. She's mine once the auction's done, Crow continued. Already made the arrangement with the boss. So keep your filthy hands to yourself, Thresh, or we're going to have problems. They're arguing over who gets to own me, Arya realized, and something inside her that had been holding on, some small stubborn flame of hope, guttered and nearly died. I'm not a person to them. I'm cargo. I'm currency. Thresh released her chin with a snarl, rising to his full height. Fine. But when she bursts that half-blood runt, I get first crack at deciding what we do with it. The words hit Arya like a physical blow. Her hands moved instinctively to her belly, chains clinking with the motion, and she felt her wolf, silent for so long, beaten into submission by grief and terror, stir with something that might have been rage. My baby, she thought fiercely. They won't touch my baby. But even as she thought it, she knew it was an empty promise. She was chained to a stake in the ground, surrounded by wolves who saw her as nothing more than breeding stock, and the father of her child was 3 months dead, killed in a border skirmish that had meant nothing and changed everything. Ronan had been kind. That was what she remembered most about him. Kind in a world that seemed determined to crush kindness out of everyone it touched. He had brought her wildflowers from the meadow and whispered promises against her skin in the dark. And when he'd learned about the baby, his eyes had lit up with a joy so pure it had made her heart ache. 2 weeks later, he was dead, and Rorik had looked at her swelling belly like it was a disease. You've ruined yourself, her brother had said, his lip curled with disgust. Pregnant with a dead soldier's bastard. No alpha will have you now. You're worthless to this family. Worthless. The word had followed her everywhere, whispered by pack members who had once smiled at her, shouted by her brother when he dragged her from her room in the middle of the night. She had screamed for her parents, but they hadn't come. Later, she had learned they had been the ones to agree to Rorik's plan, Better to sell the shameful daughter than let her disgrace taint the family name. Now she was here, in this frozen camp that smelled of blood and desperation, waiting to be sold to the highest bidder like livestock at market. The rogues moved away, their argument continuing in harsh whispers that she couldn't quite make out. Arya let her head fall back against the wooden stake, staring up at the gray sky through the skeletal branches above her. Snow was coming. She could smell it on the wind, that particular crispness that preceded a storm. If she was still chained out here when it hit, then I'll freeze to death. She finished the thought calmly, almost peacefully. And maybe that would be better. Maybe that would be easier than whatever comes next. But even as the thought formed, she felt a small flutter against her palm, a kick, tiny but insistent, from the baby growing inside her. And despite everything, despite the chains and the cold and the hopelessness that pressed down on her chest like a physical weight, Arya felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm sorry," she thought, directing the words inward toward that small life that had never asked to be born into this nightmare. "I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm so sorry your father is dead, and your mother is worthless, and—" A sound cut through her spiraling thoughts. Distant at first, but growing closer. Footsteps through the underbrush, steady and deliberate. Not the careless crashing of the rogues who move through the camp like they own the world. This was something different, something controlled. Arya raised her head, her wolf suddenly alert in a way she hadn't felt in weeks. The hair on the back of her neck prickled, and her heart began to beat faster, though she couldn't have said why. Through the trees, a figure emerged. He was alone, which was the first thing that struck her as strange. No one traveled alone through rogue territory. It was suicide. Everyone knew that. But this man walked like he owned the forest floor beneath his boots, like the bare branches parted for him out of respect rather than coincidence. He was tall. That was the second thing she noticed, her eyes tracking upward over worn leather armor and broad shoulders that spoke of a warrior's strength. His hair was dark, falling across his forehead in a way that might have looked boyish on another man, but somehow only emphasized the sharp angles of his jaw and the intensity of his gaze, and his scent. Arya inhaled sharply, her chains rattling as her body swayed toward him without conscious permission. Wood smoke and winter pine, cutting through the stench of the rogue camp like a blade through rotting cloth. It wrapped around her senses, sinking into her lungs, and her wolf lifted her head for the first time in weeks, suddenly, desperately awake. What? The rogues had noticed him now. Thresh was shouting something, reaching for the crude sword at his hip, and Crow was circling left to flank the stranger. But the man in leather didn't seem concerned. He walked forward with the same steady pace, his eyes scanning the camp until they landed on her. The world stopped. Later, Arya would try to describe what happened in that moment, but words would fail her. It was as if someone had reached into her chest and wrapped their hand around her heart, holding it still between heartbeats. It was as if every cell in her body had been sleeping and suddenly, violently, woke. It was as if she had been living her entire life in darkness and someone had torn the curtains aside to let in the sun. Heat flooded through her veins, not the painful heat of fever, but something else, something that felt like warmth and safety and home. Her wolf howled inside her skull, the sound echoing through her bones, and she heard herself make a soft, broken sound that was half gasp and half sob. "Mate," her wolf breathed, the word reverberating through every fiber of her being. Mate, mate, mate. Impossible. This was impossible. She was pregnant, chained, worthless. She was damaged goods, ruined, a disgrace to her family. How could she have a mate? How could the universe look at her broken body and breaking spirit and decide that she deserved? The stranger had stopped walking. He stood perhaps 20 feet away, his chest rising and falling with sudden, rapid breaths, and even from this distance, Arya could see his eyes change. The pupils blew wide, the iris flooding with molten gold that seemed to glow in the gray afternoon light. A growl rumbled from his chest, not threatening but aching, as if something inside him was fighting to break free. His hand rose, reaching toward her, and then froze in midair like he had been turned to stone. "What the hell are you waiting for?" Thresh demanded, raising his sword. "Kill him!" But the stranger didn't look at Thresh. He didn't look at the sword or the rogues circling him, or the other wolves emerging from the tents with weapons drawn. He looked only at Arya, his golden eyes burning into hers, and she felt the pull between them like a physical rope wrapped around her ribs, drawing her toward him, toward this impossible stranger, toward something that felt like salvation and terror all at once. "This can't be real," she thought desperately. "This can't be happening. I'm dreaming. I'm dying. I'm—" "Mate," the stranger breathed, the word barely audible, more exhale than speech. And the way he said it, like a prayer, like a revelation, like something holy and terrifying all at once, shattered the last of Arya's disbelief. Then Thresh lunged and the stranger moved. Arya had seen wolves fight before. She had watched the warriors of her pack spar in the training yards, had seen her brother and his friends engage in the brutal combat that their kind was built for. But she had never seen anything like this. The stranger didn't just fight. He annihilated. His movements were fluid, almost lazy, but each strike landed with devastating precision. Thresh went down first, his sword arm bending at an angle that made Arya's stomach lurch, and then Crow, his throat opened by claws that seemed to appear from nowhere. The other rogues fell like wheat before a scythe, their screams cut short before they could fully form. Blood sprayed across the snow, crimson against white, and still the stranger moved. He was a blur of leather and fury, his eyes burning gold even in human form, and when the last rogue fell, gurgling, hands clutching uselessly at the ruin of his chest, the silence that descended over the camp was absolute. The stranger stood in the center of the carnage, blood dripping from his hands, his chest heaving. And then he turned and walked toward Arya with the same steady pace he had entered the camp, stepping over bodies like they were fallen logs. She should have been afraid. Some part of her knew that she had just watched this man kill 6 wolves in less than a minute, knew that his hands were still wet with their blood, knew that she was chained and helpless and completely at his mercy. But her wolf wasn't afraid. Her wolf was singing. He knelt before her, and the scent of wood smoke and winter pine wrapped around her like a blanket. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the old scar that traced along his left cheekbone, the way his jaw was clenched tight as if he was fighting some internal battle she couldn't see. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, rough, scraped raw by emotions she didn't understand. Did they touch you? Harm you?" Arya opened her mouth to answer, but nothing came out. Her throat was too tight, her heart beating too fast, and all she could do was stare at him like he was something out of a fever dream. He took her silence as confirmation of the worst, and a snarl ripped from his chest, a sound of such pure rage that it should have terrified her. His claws extended, digging into the frozen earth, and his eyes blazed brighter. "I'll kill them again," he growled. "I'll find whatever hell they've gone to and kill them 1,000 times for every moment they kept you chained in this place." "They didn't—" Arya finally managed, her voice cracking on the words. "They wanted to wait. Until after the baby?" His gaze dropped to her belly, and she felt herself flinch, waiting for the disgust she had seen in every other face since her pregnancy became visible. Waiting for him to realize that his mate was carrying another wolf's child, that she was damaged, ruined, worthless. But the disgust didn't come. Instead, something soft crossed his features, something that looked almost like wonder, He reached toward her belly, then stopped, his hand hovering in the air between them. "May I?" he asked, and his voice had lost all its roughness, gentle now in a way that made her eyes burn. Arya nodded, not trusting herself to speak. His palm settled against the curve of her stomach, warm even through the thin fabric of her dress, and she watched his face as he felt the small, firm roundness of the life growing inside her. His throat worked. His eyes, still gold, still glowing, grew bright with something that might have been tears. "A pup," he breathed. There's a pup. The father is dead," Arya whispered, because she needed him to understand, needed him to know what he was looking at before he made any decisions. "He was killed in battle. And my family, they said I was worthless. They sold me to— Your family are fools." The words came out hard, clipped, and his hand pressed more firmly against her belly, as if he was trying to shield the baby from her words alone. "Worthless, worthless. They looked at you and saw something worthless. They're blind. He broke off, shaking his head, and when he met her eyes again, the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "You're not worthless," he said, each word deliberate, each word a promise. "You're my mate. You're everything. Everything I've been searching for without knowing I was searching." Arya stared at him, her mind struggling to catch up with the words that had just fallen from his lips. Everything. He had called her everything. This stranger, this blood-soaked warrior, who had torn through the rogue camp like vengeance made flesh, was kneeling before her in the frozen mud and looking at her like she was something precious. The chains around her wrists seemed suddenly heavier, the cold iron a stark reminder of her reality. She was still a prisoner, still carrying another man's child, still the same worthless daughter her family had discarded like refuse. How could he look at her and see anything else? "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking on the words. "You don't know what I am. What I've done. The things they said about me. I don't care what they said." His hand was still pressed against her belly, warm and solid and impossibly gentle for hands that had just dealt death with such brutal efficiency. "I don't care what anyone has ever said about you. Can't you feel it?" She could. That was the terrifying part. She could feel it thrumming through her veins like a second heartbeat, this impossible connection that had sprung to life the moment their eyes met. Her wolf was pacing restlessly inside her, whining with a need she couldn't name, straining toward this man like he was the answer to every question she had never known to ask. The mate bond. She had heard stories about it, of course. Everyone had. Tales of wolves who recognized their fated partners across crowded rooms, who felt the connection like lightning striking twice in the same place. But those were stories for other people. Beautiful people. Whole people. Not pregnant, discarded, worthless. "Stop." His voice was sharp, and his hand moved from her belly to cup her face, tilting her chin up until she had no choice but to meet his burning golden gaze. "Whatever you're telling yourself right now, stop. I can see it in your eyes. The way you're trying to convince yourself this isn't real, that you don't deserve this." Arya's breath caught in her throat. How could he read her so easily? They had known each other for mere minutes, and already he seemed to see past every wall she had built around her shattered heart. "The bond doesn't lie," he continued, his thumb tracing a gentle arc across her cheekbone, wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "The bond doesn't make mistakes. You are my mate, my true mate, and I will spend every day of my life proving to you that you are worth more than every lie they planted in your head." His eyes were still glowing gold, that supernatural light that marked him as something more than an ordinary wolf. The color pulsed and shifted like flames caught in amber, and Arya found herself mesmerized by their depths. There was hunger there, a raw, primal need that should have frightened her after everything she had been through. But beneath the hunger was something else, something that looked almost like reverence. I felt it, she admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. When you walked into the camp, when you looked at me, it was like, like the world suddenly made sense. He finished when she faltered. Like every moment of your life had been leading to this one. Like coming home to a place you've never been. Yes. The word was barely a whisper, but it seemed to shake something loose inside her chest. Yes, exactly like that. His breath left him in a rush, and she watched the last of the battle tension drain from his shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. I've been searching for you for so long. I didn't even know I was searching. I told myself the mate bond was a fairy tale, something that happened to other wolves but never to someone like me. And then I walked into this camp and saw you chained to a stake like an animal, and I wanted to burn the world down. You did burn it down, Arya said, glancing at the bodies scattered around them. Or close enough. A ghost of a smile crossed his features, the first she had seen, and it transformed his face from something fierce and frightening into something almost beautiful. They deserved worse. They will all deserve worse. Every single person who put those bruises on your skin and that hollow look in your eyes. I will hunt them down one by one, and I will... Please. She reached up with her chained hands, not quite touching him, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Please, just, can you get me out of these first? Before we talk about hunting anyone? He looked down at the chains as if seeing them for the first time, and a snarl ripped from his throat. Forgive me. I should have... Immediately. I should have... His claws extended in a flash of silver, and before Arya could process what was happening, the chains fell away from her wrists with a sound like breaking promises. The sudden freedom was almost painful after so long in bondage. Her arms dropped to her sides like dead weight, and she hissed as blood rushed back into her hands. Can you stand? He was already rising, already reaching for her, his hands hovering uncertainly like he was afraid to touch her. We need to leave this place. There may be more of them. And you need warmth. And food, and... He broke off as Arya attempted to push herself to her feet and immediately crumpled. Her legs had been folded beneath her for too long, the muscles cramped and useless, and she would have fallen face first into the frozen mud if he hadn't caught her. His arms wrapped around her like bands of iron, but gentle iron, if such a thing could exist. He lifted her against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all, cradling her with a careful tenderness that made her throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. I have you, he murmured against her hair. I have you. You're safe now. I swear on my life, on my blood, on everything I am. You are safe. Arya should have protested. She should have insisted on walking herself, on maintaining what little dignity she had left. But the warmth of his body was seeping into her frozen bones, and his scent was wrapping around her like a blanket woven from safety itself, and for the first time in weeks, months, she felt something that might have been hope stir in the hollow space behind her ribs. She let her head fall against his shoulder and closed her eyes. I don't even know your name, she said quietly as he carried her away from the nightmare camp, stepping over bodies with the casual grace of a predator who had eliminated every threat and knew it. Eric, he said. My name is Eric. The trees closed around them as he walked, the sounds of the ruined camp fading behind them until all Arya could hear was the crunch of his boots through the snow and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her ear. She should have been afraid, she knew. She should have questioned where he was taking her, what he intended, whether she had simply traded one captor for another. But her wolf was quiet for the first time in weeks. Not the beaten-down silence of submission, but something else. A peaceful stillness that felt like trust, like coming home. There's a stream not far from here, Eric said, his voice rumbling through his chest and into her body. Clean water. We'll stop there, get you cleaned up, and then, there are things I need to tell you. Things you need to know before we go any further. What kind of things? He was silent for a long moment, and when Arya tilted her head up to look at his face, she found his jaw clenched tight, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Things about who I am, he finally said. What I am. Things that might change how you see me. A thread of unease wound through her chest, but her wolf remained calm, and Arya found herself trusting that animal instinct more than her own racing thoughts. You just killed 6 rogues without breaking a sweat, and you're worried about how I'll see you. That ghost smile again, there and gone in a flash. The killing is the easy part, it's everything else that's complicated. They walked in silence after that. Or rather, he walked while she lay in his arms and tried to make sense of the past hour. Her brother had sold her to rogues. She had been chained to a stake, waiting to be auctioned like cattle. And then this man, this stranger with his burning gold eyes and his gentle hands, had walked out of the trees and torn her captors apart, and somewhere in the chaos, the mate bond had snapped into place like a lock, finally finding its key. It was too much. All of it, too much to process, too much to understand. So Arya stopped trying to understand and simply let herself exist in this moment, wrapped in warmth and wood smoke and the scent of winter pine. The stream appeared through the trees like a gift, a ribbon of clear water that caught the weak afternoon light and sparkled despite the gray sky above. Eric carried her to the bank and set her down with exquisite care, keeping one hand on her shoulder to steady her until he was sure she could sit upright on her own. The water will be cold, he said, shrugging out of his leather armor and laying it on a nearby rock. But you have blood in your hair, and mud, and I thought you might want to wash it away. The evidence of that place. Arya raised a trembling hand to her hair and felt the stiff, matted texture of dried blood. Whether hers or someone else's, she couldn't tell. Her skin was streaked with filth, her dress torn and stained beyond recognition. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been dragged through hell. I'll turn around, Eric continued. And there was something almost awkward in his voice now, something that seemed impossible from a man who had fought like a demon incarnate mere minutes ago. You can undress and wash, and I'll keep watch. No one will come near you while I'm here. You could help me. The words were out before Arya could stop them, and she felt heat flood her cheeks. What was she doing? What was she thinking? She had just been rescued from men who had wanted to use her body for profit, and now she was asking her stranger mate to help her undress. But Eric didn't leer. He didn't smirk or make any suggestive comment. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression serious and focused. If that's what you need, tell me what to do. Arya's hands were shaking too badly to manage the laces at the back of her dress, so she turned and let him undo them with fingers that were surprisingly deft for their size. When the fabric loosened around her shoulders, she felt a moment of vulnerability so intense, it nearly choked her, but then his hands withdrew immediately, giving her space. I'll get the water ready, he said, and she heard him move toward the stream. By the time she had struggled out of the ruined dress and lowered herself into the shallows, gasping at the cold that bit into her skin, Eric had returned with handfuls of soft moss that he used to scrub gently at the blood caked in her hair. Lean back, he instructed, and when she complied, his fingers worked through the tangles with a patience she hadn't expected. He didn't pull or yank or grow frustrated with the mats. He simply worked at them one by one, rinsing and rubbing until the water ran clear instead of pink. Is the baby comfortable? He asked as he worked, and the question was so unexpected that Arya felt tears prick at her eyes. What? The baby. Is the water too cold? Should I don't know much about pregnancy, but I know cold can be dangerous. If you need to get out, the baby is fine. Arya pressed a hand to her belly, feeling the familiar flutter of movement beneath her palm. Active, actually. I think, I think the baby might sense the bond too. Eric's hands stilled in her hair. Is that possible? I don't know. I don't know anything about this. I never expected to have a mate. I never expected any of this. He resumed his gentle ministrations, but she could feel the tension in his touch now, the questions he was holding back. Do you need food? When did you last eat? The rogues. Did they feed you at all, or scraps? Sometimes, when they remembered. The admission felt shameful, though she knew it shouldn't. They wanted to keep me alive until the birth. Wasn't much point in doing more than that. A growl rumbled through his chest, low and dangerous, but his hands remained gentle in her hair. When we reached my camp, he stopped himself, something flashing across his face. When we reach the camp, he amended, you'll have proper food, warm clothes, a bed, everything you need. There was something in the way he said my camp, and then corrected himself that tugged at Arya's attention, but the cold was sinking into her bones now, and exhaustion was pulling at the edges of her consciousness. I think I'm clean enough, she managed through chattering teeth. Eric helped her out of the water immediately, wrapping his leather vest around her shoulders with no apparent concern for his own comfort. The vest was far too large, falling past her hips, but it was warm with his body heat, and it smelled like him, that intoxicating blend of wood smoke and winter pine that made her wolf purr with contentment. We need to move, he said, gathering his scattered armor and the ruined remnants of her dress. There's shelter not far from here, and… He hesitated, that same strange tension flickering through his expression. My war party should have caught up by now. They'll have supplies. Medicine, if you need it. War party? I was traveling alone ahead of them, scouting. The explanation felt incomplete, but Arya was too tired to push. They're good wolves. Loyal. They won't harm you. And if they try… The smile that crossed his face was nothing like the gentle ghost smiles from before. This one was pure wolf, predatory and possessive, and utterly without mercy. Then they'll learn what happens to anyone who touches my mate. The journey to his camp took longer than Arya expected, though whether that was due to actual distance or her own fading strength, she couldn't tell. Eric carried her the entire way, refusing to let her walk despite her protests that she was capable of managing on her own. You're exhausted, he said flatly. You're malnourished. You're pregnant. And you've just experienced what I can only imagine was one of the most traumatic events of your life. You're not walking anywhere until I'm certain you won't collapse. I'm stronger than I look. I don't doubt it. But even the strongest wolves need help sometimes. The camp, when they reached it, was larger than Arya had expected. Dozens of tents arranged in neat rows, fires burning at regular intervals, wolves moving with the disciplined efficiency of a trained military force. This wasn't a band of wanderers or a hunting party. This was an army. On the way, Eric paused at a wild rose bush growing at the camp's edge, its crimson blooms defiant against the cold. Without a word, he plucked a handful and tucked them into her lap. For you, he said simply, as though giving flowers to a blood-soaked stranger he had just rescued was the most natural thing in the world. Eric carried her to the largest tent at the center of the camp, and Arya caught the startled looks of the wolves they passed. Whispers followed them like shadows. The commander's back. Is that a woman? Where did he… She's injured. Look at her wrists. Pregnant. She's clearly pregnant. What the hell? Eric's jaw tightened with each comment, but he didn't slow until he had ducked through the tent flap and deposited her carefully on a low cot piled with furs. Wait here, he said, his voice clipped. I need to speak with my generals. There's water in the pitcher, food in the chest. Eat whatever you need. I'll be back as quickly as I can. He was gone before she could respond, the tent flap swinging shut behind him. Arya pulled the furs around her shoulders and looked around the tent. It was simply furnished but well appointed. A commander's quarters, clearly, with maps spread across a table and weapons mounted on a rack near the entrance. Through the thick canvas walls she could hear raised voices. Found her where? In a rogue camp? She was chained, Marcus. Chained like an animal and left out in the cold. And you just brought her here? Without knowing who she is, where she came from. She's my mate. Silence. Absolute, ringing silence. And then, more quietly, a voice that sounded older, more measured. Your mate, my lord? Don't. Eric's voice was sharp enough to cut. Don't call me that. Not yet. She doesn't know. Doesn't know what? That she's somehow bonded herself to the... I said not yet. Another pause, and then the older voice again. Gentler this time. You'll have to tell her eventually. She'll figure it out as soon as she sees the banners. Here's how the wolves address you. I know. I need time. She's been through hell. The last thing she needs is to learn that her mate is... He stopped, and Arya strained to hear, her heart pounding in her chest. Just give me time. Please. Her mate was what? Arya's mind raced through possibilities, each one more alarming than the last. A criminal? An exile? Some kind of monster who wore a human face? But no, that didn't fit with the respect in the older wolf's voice, the way the camp was organized like a military operation, the quality of the furnishings in this tent. The tent flap opened again, and Eric ducked inside, his expression carefully composed. Behind him came 3 wolves, 2 men and a woman, all wearing armor that looked significantly more elaborate than his plain leather. Arya, Eric said, moving to stand beside the cot with an air of protectiveness that made her wolf hum with approval. These are my generals, Marcus, Kira, and Tomas. The generals bowed, and the movement was too formal, too precise for a simple introduction. Arya felt the first tendril of suspicion curl through her chest. She's lovely, the woman, Kira, said, though her tone was carefully neutral. Where exactly did you say you found her? I didn't. Eric's voice carried a warning that was impossible to miss. And I'll thank you to remember that she's been through a serious ordeal. Questions can wait until she's rested. Of course. Marcus, the older wolf who had spoken outside, inclined his head. Though I'm afraid some matters can't wait, my lord. The coronation will proceed as planned. Eric cut him off with a sharp gesture. We'll discuss it later. For now, I need warm food brought to this tent, clean clothes, and a healer to examine her injuries. At once, Marcus caught himself, glancing at Arya with an expression she couldn't quite read. At once, Commander. The generals filed out, but not before Arya caught the look that passed between them. A look of worry, calculation, and something that might have been pity. What are they not telling me? She asked as soon as they were alone. Eric sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. It's complicated. So uncomplicated. He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw the conflict playing out behind his eyes. You're exhausted. You need food and rest. Can it wait until... I've spent weeks as a prisoner, being kept in the dark about my own fate. Arya was surprised by the steel in her own voice. I won't be kept in the dark again, not by anyone, not even my mate. Something shifted in his expression. Respect, she thought, mixed with a resignation that suggested he had known this moment was coming. You're right, he said quietly. You deserve the truth. He crossed to a chest in the corner of the tent and withdrew something wrapped in dark cloth. When he unfolded the fabric, Arya saw a circlet of silver and sapphire. A crown, she realized with dawning horror. A king's crown. My name is Eric Stoneheart, he said, and his voice was heavy with the weight of what he was about to reveal. And I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. You haven't just found your mate, Arya. You've found the wolf who rules half the known world. The crown gleamed in the dim light of the tent, each sapphire catching the flickering glow of the oil lamps like captured pieces of winter's sky. Arya stared at it, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing, what her ears had just heard. The Alpha King. Her mate was the Alpha King. "Say something," Eric said, his voice rough with an uncertainty she hadn't heard from him before. "Please." But what was there to say? She was a disgraced Omega, pregnant with another wolf's child, sold by her own brother to rogues for the price of his gambling debts. And somehow, impossibly, the fates had bound her to the most powerful wolf in the known world. The absurdity of it threatened to crack something inside her chest, whether laughter or sobs, she couldn't quite tell. "You lied to me," she finally managed, and the words came out smaller than she intended. "You let me believe you were a soldier, a scout. You washed blood from my hair and asked if the water was too cold, and the whole time you were—" She gestured helplessly at the crown, at the tent, at everything around them that suddenly made terrible, perfect sense. "You were this." Eric set the crown down carefully as though it might shatter, and crossed to kneel beside her cot. This close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands trembled slightly as he reached for hers and then stopped, uncertain of his welcome. "I didn't lie about anything that mattered," he said. "Everything I told you was true. I am a soldier. I've been fighting since I could hold a blade. The scout camp was mine to command. The only thing I omitted was the title." He paused, and something vulnerable crept into his expression. "And I omitted it because I've seen what that title does. How it changes the way people look at me, speak to me, treat me. I wanted you to know me first. Eric. Just Eric." "Just Eric," she repeated, and a hysterical laugh bubbled up before she could stop it. "There is no just Eric. There's only the Alpha King, and I'm—" She gestured at herself, at her swollen belly, at the healing wounds that still marked her wrists from the rogue's chains. "Look at me. I'm damaged goods. I'm carrying another wolf's pup. Your generals already see it. I heard them whispering about what you've brought home. How can you possibly think—" "Stop." The word was gentle but firm, and Eric's hands finally closed around hers, warm and steady. "You're not damaged. You're surviving. There's a difference." His thumb traced circles on her palm, and despite everything, she felt her wolf leaning toward him, craving his touch with an intensity that frightened her. "And the pup you carry? It will be our pup. Mine by bond and choice, if not by blood. Any wolf who suggests otherwise will answer to me." Arya shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. "You can't just decide that. You're a king. You need heirs of your own blood, legitimate children to carry on your line, a pregnant Omega with no status and no family." "I have all the status I require," Eric interrupted. "And family is earned, not inherited. Your brother proved that much." His jaw tightened at the mention of Rorik Duskwalker, a flash of the predator she had glimpsed in the rogue's camp. As for heirs— He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth spiraling through her chest. "I'd rather have one child loved than a dozen bred for politics. I've seen what that kind of dynasty does to wolves. I won't repeat my father's mistakes." Before she could respond, the tent flap opened and a servant entered carrying a tray of food, thick slices of roasted meat, fresh bread, and a bowl of something that smelled of herbs and honey. The servant's eyes darted between them, cataloging Eric's position kneeling at her bedside, the crown still resting on the chest where he had left it. "Your Majesty," the servant murmured, bowing low. "The healer will arrive shortly. Is there anything else you require?" "Privacy," Eric said flatly. "And spread the word. The woman in this tent is to be addressed as Lady Arya. Anyone who speaks of her with anything less than complete respect will be dismissed from my service. Immediately." The servant's eyes widened, but he bowed again and retreated quickly, the tent flap falling shut behind him. Arya stared at Eric, something fragile and terrified blooming in her chest. You didn't have to do that? I know. He rose to his feet and lifted the tray, carrying it to a small table beside her cot. Eat. You need your strength, and the healer will want to examine you properly once you've had some food. She wanted to argue, to demand more answers, to understand how this impossible situation could possibly lead anywhere but heartbreak. But her body had other priorities. The smell of the food hit her properly, and her stomach cramped with desperate hunger. She had eaten nothing but scraps for weeks, whatever the rogues had deemed fit to throw at her to keep their merchandise alive. The first bite of bread made her want to weep. Eric watched her eat, his expression softening with each mouthful she managed. He didn't speak, didn't push, just sat in a chair nearby with his elbows on his knees and his attention fixed entirely on her. As though she were the most important thing in the world, as though nothing existed beyond the walls of this tent, it was the kindness that undid her. Not the revelation of his identity, not the crown, not the promises he made with such fierce certainty. Just this. The quiet attention, the patient waiting, the way he looked at her like she mattered. The tears came without warning, sliding down her cheeks between bites of meat and sips of the honey herb drink. She couldn't stop them, couldn't explain them, couldn't do anything but let them fall while Eric made a sound low in his throat and moved to sit on the edge of her cot, gathering her carefully into his arms. I've got you, he murmured against her hair. I've got you, Arya. You're safe now. You're home. She didn't believe him. She couldn't. Not yet. But she let herself be held anyway. Let herself sink into his warmth and breathe in his scent, pine and wood smoke, and something that felt inexplicably like belonging. Her wolf curled into the embrace with a contentment she hadn't felt in months, and for the first time since her brother had dragged her from her bed and sold her to monsters, Arya allowed herself to imagine that maybe, somehow, things might actually be okay. 3 days later, they reached the capital. Arya had traveled in a covered carriage for most of the journey, her body still too weak for horseback, and her pregnancy too advanced for rough terrain. Eric had ridden alongside her whenever possible, opening the carriage door during rest stops to check on her, to bring her food, to simply sit with her in comfortable silence while the camp bustled around them. She was beginning to trust him. That was the terrifying part. Not fully, not completely. The wounds left by her brother's betrayal ran too deep for that. But in small ways, in incremental moments, her walls were crumbling. The way Eric always asked permission before touching her. The way he spoke to her belly as though the child inside were already his, already loved, already part of their strange little family. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with such naked wonder that it made her breath catch. He was not what she had expected an alpha king to be. He was something far more dangerous. He was kind. The capital rose around them as they entered through the main gates, a sprawling city of stone and timber that climbed the slopes of a mountain and spread across the valley below. Wolves lined the streets to watch their king's return, cheering and throwing flowers, their faces bright with celebration. But Arya saw the way some of them looked at her carriage with curiosity and calculation, saw the whispers that passed between them as word spread that the king had returned with a woman, a pregnant woman, a mystery. The palace itself was magnificent and terrifying in equal measure, a fortress of gray stone with towers that scraped the sky and banners bearing the royal crest snapping in the mountain wind. Servants streamed out to greet them, bowing to Eric and casting uncertain glances at Arya as he helped her down from the carriage. "Welcome home, my lady," he murmured, and the words sent a shiver down her spine. Home. She had never had one of those. Not really. Her family's pack had been a place of obligation and resentment, her role within it never more than servant and scapegoat. Could this cold stone fortress really become something different? A week passed, Then, too, Arya was given chambers adjoining Eric's own, richly furnished rooms with silk curtains, and a bed so soft she felt like she was sleeping on clouds. Healers attended her daily, monitoring her pregnancy and treating the last of her injuries. One of them, an elderly woman with knowing eyes, had paused during an examination, her hand hovering over Arya's heart. "The bond is strong in you," she had murmured, "stronger than I've seen in decades. When it completes, you'll be able to feel the entire pack. Call to them if you need to. It's Aluna's gift, and Aluna's burden." Arya had dismissed the words as superstition. She was an Omega, nothing more. Seamstresses arrived to measure her for new gowns, fabrics finer than anything she had ever touched. Servants addressed her as "my lady" with increasing naturalness, as though her position in the household were already settled fact. But not everyone was happy about the Alpha King's mysterious mate. Arya noticed it in small ways at first. A servant who was slow to respond to her requests, a courtier who forgot to bow when she entered a room, a cluster of nobles who fell silent when she approached and burst into whispered laughter the moment she passed. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the bond growing stronger between her and Eric, on the child quickening in her belly, on the future he painted for her with such vivid certainty. Then the notes began. The first one appeared on her pillow after a bath, folded neatly and sealed with plain wax. "You don't belong here," it read in cramped, angular handwriting. "You never will. Blood tells, little Omega. Blood always tells." She showed it to Eric, who snarled and ordered an investigation. Guards were posted at her door. The palace staff was questioned, but no culprit was found, and the notes kept coming. "Did you think the king would keep you? You're a broodmare, nothing more. Once the novelty fades, you'll be discarded like the trash you are. Your brother was right to sell you. Some wolves are born to be owned. Watch what you eat, little Omega. Poison is a woman's weapon, but wolves use it too." That last note made her blood run cold. She stopped eating anything that hadn't been prepared in front of her, refused to drink from cups she hadn't poured herself. The paranoia gnawed at her, eroding the fragile peace she had been building. "I'm having all your food tested before it reaches you," Eric told her one evening, his expression dark with fury. "Every dish, every drink, I've assigned a dedicated taster." "That's not enough, and you know it." Arya paced the length of her chambers, one hand pressed to her belly where the baby kicked restlessly. "Someone in this palace wants me gone, wants me dead maybe, and we have no idea who. I have suspicions." His voice was low, dangerous. "There are factions who oppose our mating. Lords who expected me to choose a bride from their daughters. Rivals who see vulnerability in a king who's bound himself to a—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "To a disgraced Omega carrying another wolf's child," Arya finished flatly. "You can say it. I know what I am. You are my mate." Eric crossed to her in 3 strides, his hands closing around her shoulders with desperate gentleness. "You are the other half of my soul. You are the mother of the pup who will be my heir, blood or no blood. And I will tear apart anyone who tries to harm you, do you understand? Anyone." She believed him. That was the terrifying thing. She believed every word. But belief couldn't stop poison, couldn't catch a shadow, couldn't protect her from the hatred of wolves who thought she was unworthy of their king. That night, she dreamed of her brother. Rorik Duskwalker stood in the garden of the palace, wearing servant's clothes, his face twisted with the same cruel smile he had worn when he dragged her from her bed and sold her to rogues. "Did you think you could escape me, sister? Did you think you could rise above your station?" In the dream, he raised a knife that dripped with something dark and viscous. "Poison," her dreaming mind whispered, and advanced toward her while she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to scream. She woke gasping, drenched in sweat. Eric's arms already around her as he pulled her against his chest and murmured soothing nonsense into her hair. "Just a dream," he whispered. "Just a dream, little wolf. I'm here. You're safe." But was she? Could she be? And why, even in sleep, couldn't she shake the feeling that her brother was closer than anyone realized? The coronation was 3 days away when Arya finally began to relax. The notes had stopped. Or at least, no new ones had appeared in nearly a week. The investigation continued, but Eric's reassurances had begun to work their way past her defenses. She was safe. She was protected. Whatever enemy had targeted her had seemingly given up. She was such a fool. The truth revealed itself on a quiet afternoon in the palace library. Arya had taken to spending hours there, curled in a window seat with books about pack history and royal lineage, trying to educate herself for the role she was about to assume. She had just closed a particularly dry tome on territorial law when she heard voices from the corridor outside. Familiar voices, though one made no sense at all. "You understand what's required?" A woman's voice, aristocratic and cold. "The wolf's bane must be administered in small doses. Too much at once and she'll taste it, suspect something. But if you do this correctly, the child will weaken first. By the time the birth comes, the brat will be dead, and she'll be too weak to fight." A man's voice this time, and Arya's blood turned to ice in her veins. She knew that voice. She had grown up with that voice, had fled from it in her nightmares for weeks, had prayed she would never hear it again. Rorik Duskwalker. Her brother was in the palace. Her brother had been in the palace for God only knew how long, and he was planning to kill her child. The library blurred around her as terror swamped her senses. She pressed herself deeper into the window seat, praying the heavy curtains concealed her, barely daring to breathe. Her hand found her belly, cradling the life inside as the voices continued their terrible conversation. "And when the Alpha King discovers his heir is dead?" The woman again, her tone pragmatic, as though discussing grain shipments rather than murder. "He'll blame her weak Omega blood, the halfling's sire, anything but his own household." Duskwalker's laugh made Arya's stomach turn. "By then, I'll have sent word to Lord Harvick. His men will be positioned for the coronation. In the chaos after the ceremony, when the king is distracted by grief and politics. We take the Omega and deliver her as promised." "Exactly. And I finally get what I'm owed." Footsteps echoed in the corridor, moving away from the library door. Arya stayed frozen in her hiding spot for long minutes, trembling, her mind racing through implications and horrors. Her brother was here. Her brother was poisoning her food. Had been poisoning her food, despite the precautions, despite the tasters. The aristocratic woman must have replaced the dedicated taster with one of her own servants, someone loyal to their conspiracy rather than to the crown. The wolfsbane was targeting her baby, slowly weakening the child she had grown to love over these precious weeks of safety. And at the coronation, in 3 short days, they planned to take her again. To drag her back into the nightmare she had only just escaped. She had to find Eric. She had to warn him, tell him everything, pray that he believed her before it was too late. But as she crept from the library on shaking legs, a terrible thought occurred to her. What if this was exactly what her enemies wanted? What if they were counting on her panicked flight to the king, knowing she had no proof, nothing but overheard words that could easily be denied? The woman in the corridor had been aristocratic, influential. Duskwalker had clearly been passing as a servant for some time without detection. If Arya burst in with accusations and no evidence, she might only succeed in alerting them that she knew. And then they would move up their timeline, strike before she could prepare. No. She needed to be smart about this. She needed to think like a survivor, not a victim. She needed to find proof. And she needed to find it now. Arya's hands trembled as she slipped through the palace corridors, her mind racing through every possibility, every potential trap. She needed proof. She needed something tangible, something that would make Eric believe her without alerting her brother that she knew. The servant quarters lay in the eastern wing, a maze of narrow hallways and cramped rooms that she had never had reason to visit. But if Rorik was posing as a servant, that was where she would find evidence of his true identity. She kept her head down as she walked, one hand resting on her belly in what she hoped looked like a protective gesture, rather than a terrified one. The baby shifted inside her, a flutter of movement that reminded her of everything at stake. Not just her life, not just her fragile happiness with Eric. Her child's life hung in the balance, threatened by the very blood that should have protected them both. The servant quarters were quiet at this hour, most of the staff occupied with preparations for the coronation. Arya moved through the corridors on silent feet, her wolf senses straining for any hint of her brother's distinctive scent, that particular combination of cedar and something sour that she had learned to associate with cruelty long before she understood what the word meant. She found it in the third room she checked, a small chamber, barely larger than a closet, with a narrow bed and a battered trunk that sat at its foot. The scent was unmistakable. Her brother had been sleeping here, living here, walking these halls while she ate meals he had poisoned and trusted in protections he had already circumvented. Her hands shook as she opened the trunk, rifling through rough-spun servant's clothing until her fingers closed on something that made her heart stop. A vial of dark liquid, half empty, with sediment swirling at its base. Wolfsbane, concentrated, potent, exactly as the woman in the corridor had described. Beneath it, a bundle of letters tied with a leather cord. Arya's breath caught as she recognized the seal pressed into the wax. Lord Harvick's banner, the very name her brother had mentioned in his terrible conversation. She had her proof. Now she needed to reach Eric before it was too late. But as she turned toward the door, the air shifted behind her. A hand closed around her throat, slamming her back against the wall with enough force to steal her breath. And there, inches from her face, was the nightmare she had been running from since the moment she woke in chains. "Hello, sister," Rorik Duskwalker said, his smile a twisted mirror of the brother she had once loved. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" The confrontation that followed happened so fast that Arya would later struggle to piece together the sequence of events. Rorik's fingers tightened on her throat, cutting off her air, making spots dance at the edges of her vision. His other hand found her belly, pressing down with cruel precision, and she felt her wolf surge against her skin with a fury she had never experienced before. "You always were too curious for your own good," he hissed, "always poking into things that didn't concern you. Do you know how much trouble you caused when you survived the rogue camp? I had to scramble to find you, to make new arrangements with Harvick. And then, you went and bonded with the Alpha King himself." He laughed, the sound devoid of any warmth. "I should thank you, really. Your value increased tenfold. Harvick is willing to pay a fortune for the Alpha King's mate." "Eric." She could barely force the word past his grip on her throat. "Please. The baby." The baby was never supposed to survive. Another mouth to feed. Another complication. At least the wolfsbane has been taking care of that problem. His eyes glittered with satisfaction. "By the time you birth that weakened pup, if it survives at all, it won't be strong enough to trouble anyone. Just like its whore of a mother." Something snapped inside Arya then. Not her spine, not her will. Something deeper. Something that had been dormant all her life, waiting for exactly this moment to wake. She felt it rising through her chest like liquid fire, spreading through her veins, burning away the fear that had defined her existence for so long. The mate bond pulsed at the edge of her consciousness, incomplete but present, a thread of gold light connecting her to Eric Stoneheart wherever he was in this sprawling palace. And through that bond, through the power that their connection had awakened in her Omega blood, she reached out, not to call for help, to claim what was hers. The pack bond opened like a floodgate. She felt them. Every wolf in the palace, every guard and servant and noble who had sworn allegiance to her mate, their consciousness brushed against hers, startled, confused, responding to the desperate call of their future Luna. And through them, she sent a single, blazing message: Garden, Eastern Wing, now. Rorik's grip faltered as her eyes blazed gold. What are you? What is this? She drove her elbow into his ribs with all the strength she could muster, feeling bone crunch beneath the impact. He howled in pain and released her throat, staggering backward, and in that moment of freedom, Arya did something she had never done in her entire life. She attacked. Her claws. When had she grown claws? Raked across his face, leaving furrows of red that would scar even with a wolf's healing. She was snarling. Actually snarling, her wolf surging so close to the surface that she could feel fur prickling along her arms. Duskwalker stumbled backward through the doorway, his face a mask of shock and fury, and Arya followed him, driven by an instinct more powerful than fear. She was protecting her pack, she was protecting her child, and she would not be a victim again. They crashed into the garden, Rorik scrambling to regain his footing while Arya stalked after him with a predator's grace she had never possessed before. The evening light painted everything in shades of gold and crimson, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of running footsteps, voices shouting, the pack responding to her call. You think you can fight me? Rorik spat blood onto the grass, his eyes wild. You're an Omega, a breeder. You were born to be sold, sister. That's all you were ever good for. I was born, Arya said, and her voice was steady, stronger than she had ever heard it. To be someone's mate, to be a mother, to be a queen. She let the words settle between them, watching his face contort with disbelief. You sold me because you thought I was worthless, but you were wrong. I was worth finding my true mate. I was worth this kingdom. And I am worth more than every coin you ever counted in your pathetic, miserable life. Rorik's hand went to his belt, pulling free a blade that gleamed with something dark and oily. More wolfsbane, concentrated enough to kill on contact. He lunged toward her, murder in his eyes, and Arya braced herself for impact. It never came. Eric Stoneheart hit her brother like a force of nature, slamming him to the ground with enough force to crack the flagstones beneath them. The knife went flying, landing harmlessly in a bed of roses, the same roses Eric had brought her that first night. She realized with a hysterical edge of humor. Her mate's claws were at Rorik's throat, his eyes blazing with the fury of an alpha defending what was his, and when he spoke, his voice was barely recognizable. You sold your pregnant sister to rogues. The words were a death sentence, spoken with the cold certainty of a king passing judgment. You poisoned her food. You threatened her child. And now you try to murder her in my own garden. Guards surrounded them, drawn by Arya's call, their faces grim as they witnessed the scene. General Marcus stood among them, his hand on his sword, his expression one of barely contained fury. These were wolves who had sworn to protect their Luna, and they had nearly failed. She was mine to sell. Rorik struggled beneath Eric's grip, his voice rising to a panicked shriek. Our father gave her to me when he died. She was property, just property. The gambling debts were his fault, not mine. What was I supposed to do? Anything, Arya said, stepping forward until she stood beside her mate, looking down at the brother who had destroyed her world. Anything but what you did. You could have asked for help. You could have worked to repay the debts. You could have been a brother. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she felt Eric's free hand find hers, steadying her. Instead, you chose to sell me, to poison my child, to take everything from me because it was easier than facing your own failures. You were never worth anything else. Duskwalker spat. But his voice was weak now, his eyes darting around the circle of hostile faces with growing terror. You were just a burden, a mouth to feed, An omega with no prospects and a bastard in her belly. She is my mate. Eric's voice cut through his brother-in-law's tirade like a blade. She is the mother of the heir I will raise as my own. She is the Luna Queen of the Northern Territories, and she is worth more than every member of your worthless bloodline combined. He leaned closer, his claws pressing into Duskwalker's throat until blood welled up around them. What do you have to say for yourself? Rorik's eyes found Arya's, and in them she saw no remorse, no regret. Only the same bitter hatred that had defined their relationship since childhood. She was never worth more than coin, he said, and she never will be. The words settled over the garden like a shroud, and Arya felt something shift inside her. Not pain. She was done letting his cruelty hurt her. Something more like closure. The final severing of a bond that had never been real in the first place. I was worth finding my true mate, she said softly. Can you say the same of your life? There was no answer. There could be no answer. And when she nodded to Eric, giving him the permission he had been waiting for, the Alpha King tore out her brother's throat in one clean motion. Blood splashed across the flagstones, across the roses, across the garden that had been her sanctuary since arriving at the palace. But Arya felt no horror at the sight, only relief, only the bone-deep certainty that the nightmare was finally, truly over. It's done, Eric said, rising to his feet and pulling her into his arms. His hands cupped her face, his eyes searching hers for any sign of distress. It's done, little wolf. He can't hurt you anymore. She buried her face in his chest and let herself break. The sobs came without warning, weeks of terror and tension and barely suppressed panic pouring out of her in a flood she couldn't have contained if she tried. Eric held her through all of it, his hands stroking her hair, his voice murmuring promises against her temple. Safe. She was safe. Her baby was safe. And the brother who had sold her to monsters was dead on the ground, never to threaten anyone again. It was Marcus who finally broke the moment, his voice gruff but gentle. The healers should examine the queen, your majesty. If she's been exposed to wolfsbane? Yes. Eric's arms tightened around her. Yes, of course. Arya, can you walk? The healers will make sure the baby is well. She nodded against his chest, not trusting her voice, and let him guide her toward the palace. Behind them, guards moved to deal with her brother's body, their movements efficient and impersonal. He would not receive a burial with honors. He would not receive anything but the unmarked grave reserved for traitors. By morning, the investigation would uncover his co-conspirators, Lady Harvick, Lord Harvick's own sister, and the aristocratic woman whose voice Arya had recognized in the corridor, along with the corrupted food taster she had planted. Both would face the king's justice before the coronation bells rang, and Lord Harvick's forces would scatter like rats when word reached them that their conspiracy had been exposed. It was more than he deserved. The coronation happened 2 days later, delayed only long enough for the healers to confirm that the wolfsbane's damage could be reversed with time and care. Arya stood before the assembled nobles in a gown of white and silver, her belly proud and visible beneath the flowing fabric, and accepted the crown of Luna Queen with steady hands and clear eyes. But it was the ceremony that happened afterward, in the privacy of their chambers, that truly changed everything. Eric's hands were gentle as he guided her to the bed, his touch reverent despite the hunger burning in his golden eyes. We don't have to do this tonight, he said, though the words seemed to cost him. The mate bond can wait. You've been through so much. I've been waiting my whole life, Arya interrupted, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. I didn't know what I was waiting for until I met you. But now I know. She pulled him down until their foreheads touched, breathing him in, pine and wood smoke, and the wild scent of her mate. I want this. I want you. I want the bond complete. He kissed her then, deep and slow and devastating, and when he finally pulled back, his eyes were pure gold. "Tell me if anything hurts," he said. "Tell me if you need to stop. I would rather die than cause you pain." She smiled, feeling her wolf settle into contentment for the first time in her life. "I trust you." The first touch of his teeth against her neck made her gasp. He was at the junction of her throat and shoulder, the exact spot where a claiming bite would mark her as his forever, and his breath was hot against her skin as he paused. "Mine," he growled, the word vibrating through her bones. "Yours," she whispered back. His teeth sank into her flesh, and the world exploded. Pain bloomed first, sharp and bright and shocking, but it transformed almost instantly into something else entirely. Pleasure like nothing she had ever experienced, rolling through her body in waves that left her gasping, clinging to Eric's shoulders as the sensation crested and broke and rebuilt itself again. She could feel the bond opening between them, not just a thread now, but a river, a flood of connection that poured everything he was into, everything she was. She felt his love, fierce and protective and absolute. She felt his fear, the terror he had experienced when he thought he might lose her. She felt his joy at the life growing inside her, his determination to be the father her child deserved, his bone-deep certainty that she was the other half of his soul. And beneath all of it, she felt his vulnerability, the loneliness he had carried for years before finding her. The doubt that whispered he wasn't worthy of happiness, the scars left by duty and war and the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders. She loved him more in that moment than she had thought possible. When his teeth finally released her, she was crying again, but these were tears of joy. The bond thrummed between them, incomplete on one side, aching for the symmetry that would make it whole. "My turn," she said, and pulled him down to her. He tilted his head without hesitation, baring his throat in a gesture of submission that an alpha king had likely never offered anyone in his life. The trust in that movement, the absolute faith that she would claim him as thoroughly as he had claimed her, made her heart crack open. She bit down at the same junction she had felt his teeth mark, and the bond slammed into completion like a door finally locked. For one infinite moment, they were not two people but one. Every memory, every emotion, every secret they had ever kept flooded between them in a torrent of golden light. She knew his childhood, the stern father, the early responsibility, the moment he had first touched a crown and realized his life would never be his own. He knew hers, the cruelty, the neglect, the spark of hope she had never quite managed to extinguish. And they knew, with a certainty that transcended words, that they were exactly where they were meant to be. "Mine," Arya whispered against his skin, tasting copper and power and forever. "Yours," Eric answered, gathering her close as the bond settled into warm certainty. "Yours, always, until the stars burn out and the mountains crumble to dust. Yours." They held each other for a long time after that, wrapped in blankets and contentment, the mate bond humming between them like a second heartbeat. His hand found her belly, resting there with gentle pressure, and she felt the baby stir as if in response to its father's touch. "We should think of names," Eric said, his voice drowsy with satisfaction. "Something fitting for the heir to the Northern Territories." Arya smiled against his chest. "Something that means hope," she said. "Something that means strength. Something that reminds us both that good things can come from terrible beginnings." His arms tightened around her. "I have some ideas." Outside their windows, the kingdom stretched toward the horizon, peaceful and whole. The wolves who had whispered about damaged goods now knelt before their Luna Queen with genuine respect. The enemies who had threatened her were dead or scattered. And somewhere in the palace chapel, a single candle burned for the lover she had lost, a gentle goodbye that Eric had arranged without being asked, understanding that her heart was big enough to hold grief and joy simultaneously. She was no longer the Omega who had been sold for gambling debts. She was no longer the prisoner chained in a rogue camp, waiting for death or something worse. She was Arya Stoneheart, Luna Queen of the Northern Territories, mate to the most powerful alpha in the known world, and she was happy. The spring came slowly to the mountains, but when it arrived with a vengeance. Arya watched the snow melt from the terrace of her chambers, one hand on her swelling belly, the other wrapped around a cup of warm tea. Her baby was healthy now. The healers had confirmed it a dozen times, the wolfsbane's damage fading with every passing week. Eric found her there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, his warmth seeping into her bones. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Roses," she said, surprising herself. "You brought me roses that first night. After you killed the rogues and carried me away, I was so confused. I couldn't understand why a common soldier would bring flowers to a worthless Omega." He turned her in his arms, his expression soft in the fading light. "You were never worthless, and I was never common. I was simply waiting to find you." She rose on her toes to kiss him, and the mate bond sang between them like a promise. When they finally broke apart, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Our child will be born in summer," she said, "in warmth and light, not in chains, not in darkness." "Our child," Eric repeated, his voice thick with emotion, "will be born to a mother who survived the impossible and rose to become a queen. They will know exactly how strong they can be, because they will have you as an example." Arya leaned into his embrace, watching the stars multiply across the heavens. She thought of her brother, dead in the garden. She thought of the rogues, burned to ash by a king who had not yet revealed himself. She thought of every moment of fear and pain and despair that had led her to exactly this moment, exactly this place. She had been sold as worthless. She had risen as queen, and she had never been happier in her entire life.